Once upon a time, there lived a man and his loving wife and their little daughter Ella. The man had worked hard and done well, and the little family was happy and well off. But one sad day tragedy struck, and the beloved wife and mother fell deathly ill. Before she passed, she called her little child to her, and thus addressed her: "My dearest Ella, always be good, and bear everything that occurs to you with kindness and patience. Then, whatever toil and troubles you may suffer will someday pass, and happiness will be your lot in the end." After uttering these words, the poor lady died, and her daughter was overwhelmed with grief at the loss of so good and kind a mother. The father, too, grieved deeply. As time passed, Ella grew into a young woman with an inner beauty born of her good nature and kindness. Then, the man sought another wife, and he looked for some amiable lady who might be a good mother to his child and a companion to himself. Unfortunately, his choice fell on a widow lady of a proud and overbearing temper who had 2 daughters by a former marriage, both as haughty and bad-tempered as herself. This woman knew that Ella's father could provide a good life for her and her daughters, so she was careful to conceal her bad qualities and give the appearance of being kind and amiable. Sadly, just a few weeks after the wedding, Ella's dear father fell ill and passed away. Then the stepmother's true character showed itself. She could not endure her good-natured stepdaughter with all her charming qualities, for they only made her own daughters appear more vile. She made Ella do all the household chores, while the step-sisters idled lazily. When the poor girl finished her daily work, she was made to sit in the chimney corner among the cinders, and her step-sisters gave her the cruel nickname of Cinderella. The poor girl slept in the attic upon a hard straw mattress, whilst the bedchambers of the sisters were furnished with every luxury and elegance, and provided with mirrors in which they could survey themselves from head to foot. They adorned themselves in the finest dresses, while Cinderella was given only worn-out old clothes to wear. However, Cinderella's beauty came from her good nature deep inside her, and could not be hidden by ashes and shabby clothes. She returned their cruelty with kindness, which made them resent her all the more. It happened that the king and queen of the kingdom greatly desired grandchildren, but their only child, the prince, had not yet married. The king and queen decided to hold a regal ball and invite all the eligible young ladies from the great families throughout the kingdom. Surely from all those prospects the prince could find a suitable wife. Invitations to the ball were extended throughout the land, the 2 sisters among the rest. This delighted them extremely, and their thoughts were entirely occupied in selecting their most becoming dresses for the important occasion. Poor Cinderella had now more work to do than ever, as it was her business to iron their linen and starch their ruffles. The sisters talked of nothing but preparations for the ball. The eldest said, "I shall wear my crimson velvet dress and point lace," and the younger, "I shall put on my usual dress petticoat, a mantle embroidered with gold flowers, and a tiara of diamonds." They also called Cinderella to their aid, for she had very good taste, and she offered, in the most amiable manner, to arrange their hair, of which offer they were only too happy to avail themselves. While so occupied, the eldest said, "Cinderella, should you like to go to the ball?" "Alas," said she, "you are ridiculing me. I am not likely to go to the ball." "You are right," replied the sister. "People would be amused to see a Cinderella there." If Cinderella had been at all unamiable, she might have dressed their heads all awry for such unkindness. But she returned good for evil, and did it in the best possible style. The sisters were in such spirits they could scarcely eat for 2 days. All their time was spent before the looking-glass, and more than a dozen laces were broken in attempts to tighten their waists into elegant shapes. At length the long-wished-for evening arrived, and these proud misses stepped into their carriage and drove away to the palace. Cinderella looked after the coach as far as she could see, and then returned to the kitchen in tears, where, for the first time, she bewailed her hard and cruel lot, little dreaming that a kind fairy was at the same moment watching over her. She continued sobbing in the chimney corner until a rap at the door aroused her, and she got up to see what had caused it. She found a little old woman, hobbling on crutches, who besought her to give her some food. "I have only my own meager supper, but you are most welcome to share it. Please step in and warm yourself by the fire." "Thank you, my dear," said the old woman in a feeble, croaking voice. And when she had hobbled in and taken her seat by the fire, she continued, "Hey, dearie me, what are all these tears about, my child?" And then Cinderella told her of all her griefs, how her sisters had gone to the ball, and how she should like to have gone also. "But you shall go," exclaimed her visitor, who was suddenly transformed into a beautiful fairy, "or I am not queen of the fairies and your godmother. Dry up your tears, my dear goddaughter, and do as I bid you, and you shall have clothes and horses finer than any one." As Cinderella had often heard her father talk of her godmother, and tell her that she was one of those kind fairies who protect good children, her spirits revived, and she wiped away her tears. The fairy took Cinderella by the hand, and said, "Now, my dear, go into the garden, and fetch me a pumpkin." Cinderella went immediately to gather the best she could find, and carried it to her godmother, though she could not guess how this pumpkin could make her go to the ball. Her godmother took the pumpkin and hollowed it out, leaving only the rind. She then struck it with her wand, and the pumpkin was immediately changed into a beautiful gilt coach. She next sent Cinderella for the mousetrap, wherein were found 6 mice alive. She directed Cinderella to raise the door of the trap, and as each mouse came out, she struck it with her wand, and it was immediately changed into a beautiful horse, so that she had now 6 splendid greys for her gilt coach. The fairy was perplexed how to find a coachman, but Cinderella said, "I will go and see if there is a rat in the rat trap. If there is, he will make a capital coachman." "You are right," said the godmother. "Go and see." Cinderella brought the rat trap, in which there were 3 large rats. The fairy selected one on account of its beautiful whiskers, and having touched it, it was changed into a fat coachman with the finest pair of whiskers that ever were seen. She then said, "You must now go into the garden, where you will find 6 lizards behind the watering pot. Bring them to me." These were no sooner brought than the godmother changed them into 6 tall footmen in handsome liveries, with cocked hats and gold-headed canes, who jumped up behind the coach just as if they had been accustomed to it all their lives. The coachman and postilion having likewise taken their places, the fairy said to Cinderella, "Well, my dear girl, is not this as fine an equipage as you could desire to go to the ball with? Tell me now, are you pleased with it?" "Oh yes, dear godmother," replied Cinderella. And then, with a good deal of hesitation, she added, "But how can I make my appearance among so many finely dressed people in these shabby clothes?" "Give yourself no uneasiness about that, my dear. The most difficult part of our task is already accomplished." On saying this, the fairy touched Cinderella with her magic wand, and her clothes were instantly changed into a most magnificent ball dress ornamented with fine jewels. The fairy now took from her pocket a beautiful pair of glass slippers, which she caused Cinderella to put on, and when she had thus completed her work, and Cinderella stood before her, arrayed in her beautiful clothes, the fairy was much pleased. The fairy godmother then spoke to Cinderella with great seriousness. "My dear, you must remember this: the spell will end exactly at midnight. You must be sure of the time and leave the ball before the 12th strike of the clock. At that moment your magnificent gown, carriage, and all the rest will change back to their former state." Cinderella promised to faithfully attend to everything that the fairy had mentioned. Then 2 of the footmen sprang and opened the carriage door and assisted Cinderella into it, and then, quite overjoyed, gave the direction to the footman, who bawled out, in a loud voice, to the coachman, to the royal palace. The coachman touched his prancing horses lightly with his whip, and swiftly the carriage started off, and in a short time reached the palace. The arrival of so splendid an equipage as Cinderella's could not fail to attract general notice at the palace gates, and as it drove up to the marble portico the servants, in great numbers, came out to see it. The king's son, to whom it was announced that an unknown princess had arrived, hastened to receive her. He helped her out of the carriage and led her to the ballroom. Immediately as she entered, the dancing ceased and the violins stopped playing. So much was everyone struck with the arrival of an unknown princess, and the only sound heard was that of admiration. The prince was immediately taken by Cinderella's charm, and the more he talked with her and recognized her kindness and good nature, the more enraptured he became. He invited her to dance, and they danced with such grace that everybody paused to watch. When supper was served, the prince could partake of nothing, so much was he occupied in contemplating the fair nature of the stranger. Cinderella was likewise stricken, for the prince was very kind and charming in his own right. Cinderella's sisters looked on with envy as the prince lavished all his attention on the stranger. They did not recognize Cinderella, as they could not envision her as anything but a shabby servant. Cinderella did not notice how the time passed, and had quite forgot her godmother's injunctions. While she therefore thought it was scarcely 11 o'clock, she was startled by the first stroke of midnight. She rose very hastily and fled as lightly as a fawn. She ran so quickly that one of her glass slippers slipped from her foot. The prince ran after her, imploring her to return, but Cinderella in her great haste left him quickly behind. When he reached the palace gates, the prince inquired of the guards as to which direction the princess had gone. They replied that they had seen no one go out but a shabby peasant girl. Puzzled and crestfallen, the prince walked slowly back to the palace. Along the way he happened upon Cinderella's lost slipper, which he picked up with the greatest care. For the rest of the ball the prince ignored his guests and simply gazed upon the slipper, determined to somehow find its owner. Cinderella arrived at home out of breath, without carriage or servants, in her shabby clothes, nothing remaining of all her fleeting magnificence except one of her little glass slippers, the fellow of that she had left behind. When the two sisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked if they had enjoyed themselves. "Certainly not," they replied. "The prince paid us no attention at all. He spent all his time with a princess whom no one seems to know, and who repaid his kindness by running off without so much as a goodbye." They then reported that despite the strange princess's abrupt departure, the prince seemed to have fallen very much in love with her. This was indeed the case, for a few days after, the prince, with the sound of trumpets, announced a search for the maiden whose foot would exactly fit the slipper. He declared that when the maiden was found, he would ask her to be his bride. So the slipper was first tried on by all the princesses, then by all the duchesses, and next by all the ladies belonging to the court, but in vain. The prince then ordered the search expanded to every maiden in the kingdom until a perfect fit for the slipper could be found. After a time, the search reached the home of Cinderella and her stepsisters. The sisters sent Cinderella upstairs to clean the drapes, then each tried every possible way of getting her foot into the slipper, but without success. The official in charge of the search then asked the sisters to fetch the servant girl. The sisters immediately began to laugh and to ridicule Cinderella at the very thought that it could be she who had captured the prince's heart. But the official was insistent. "My orders are to try the slipper on every maiden in the kingdom," he declared. The sisters relented and, with great amusement, called for Cinderella. The official invited Cinderella to sit down, and at once found that the slipper slid effortlessly onto her foot and fitted her perfectly. The astonishment of the sisters was very great, but still greater when Cinderella drew from her pocket the other slipper and, to the delight of the official, placed it upon her other foot. The fairy godmother now made her appearance, and touching Cinderella with her wand, again changed Cinderella's shabby clothes into the magnificent gown she has worn at the ball. The sisters finally recognized in Cinderella the strange princess they had seen at the ball, and threw themselves at her feet to implore forgiveness for all the ill treatment they had shown her. Ella, for she would never again be called Cinderella, raised them up, and embracing them, said she forgave them with all her heart their unkindness to her, and hoped that for the future they would be kind to everyone about them. She told them she had never forgotten the wise last words of her dear mother, always be good, and bear everything that occurs to you with kindness and patience. Then, whatever toil and troubles you may suffer will someday pass, and happiness will be your lot in the end. These words now proved to be true, for having borne cruelty with kindness and patience ever since her father's death, she was now to be the wife of the king's son. Ella was transported to the palace, where she happily accepted Prince's proposal of marriage. The delighted prince found Ella more charming than ever, and in a just few days they were wed. Ella flourished in the love of her husband, the esteem of the court, and the goodwill of all who knew her. In time, Ella and the prince gave the king and queen the grandchildren they so wanted, and they all lived happily ever after.